Hi, everyone, and welcome to PK's webinar, Planning for Uncertainty, where you'll learn how to run a virtual workshop to align your leadership team to be successful over the next 6 months and beyond. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that all attendees have been muted, and if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom app, and we're going to address all questions that we have time for at the end of the presentation, and anything that we don't get to, we'll address in email as a follow-up to the webinar. I'm going to hand things over to James Kim now. He's the Principal of Experience Design at PK, and he's going to get things started.
Hi, good morning, and thanks, Linda. And thanks for attending the webinar this morning. Obviously, things are crazy, and we're all adjusting to kind of whatever we want to call it, a new normal, an abnormal, a next normal. All those things are true. And I think one thing we want to be able to do today, this morning, is talk about how do we grapple with that? How do we lead through uncertainty and help our organizations thrive into the future? Just a little bit about PK, if you're not familiar with us, we are a global IT and consulting services firm. We specialize in really kind of creating great experiences as well as driving strong technology solutions that accelerate outcomes. So that's kind of the breadth of what we do. And today, we're really here to talk about this aspect of scenario planning. We're going to kind of break this morning's conversation into 3 parts. The first part is we'll talk just about scenario planning in brief, do a little bit of grounding. There are a lot of things that it is and it isn't. We're going to go through our current context and create and look at some scenarios that may be relevant to you, but keeping in mind that really to make scenario planning a valuable exercise for you, it has to be specific. And then lastly, we'll finish up with talking about how you might take action coming from a scenario planning exercise. So one thing about forecasting and scenario planning is, it's really, really hard to forecast the future. And one thing that scenario planning is not, is actually not a prediction of the future. It's not a forecasting methodology, and it certainly isn't a strategy. What scenario planning does do for us as practitioners is it helps us as teams and leadership teams try to understand and identify possible futures and align on them. And that's something that we see with our clients as a critical aspect of success or failure, is to the degree that leadership teams are able to align. As a tool, it flushes out and confronts kind of unspoken assumptions about what's actually happening with your leadership team. Often we all are consuming the same kinds of information. We are looking at a lot of the same data, and yet we come away from looking at those data points with different perspectives, and we don't really talk about those out loud. They turn into initiatives, they turn into projects, they turn into motions, and they aren't aligned. And in particular now, given the future that we are living in, it's really critical to be aligned. And so that leads us kind of to this last point, which is really, scenario planning is creating a set of stories that really help leadership teams be resilient and be impactful in our current environment. So what are the elements of scenario planning? There are really 2 things as inputs. And these 2 things are quite broad, and I've kind of characterized these things as trends. And trends are things that define what we know or think about our business. A lot of times they are informed by data. We track these things, they're metrics driven. And sometimes they are softer. There are trends about like consumer preferences, which we may or may not know a lot about. The data may or may not be perfect, but we have ideas about how those things affect our business. And we've been using those kinds of data and these kinds of trends in our day-to-day work in the past. Critical uncertainties, sometimes these are referred to as black swan events. We are living in one now, depending on who you talk to. But really, these are things that change your assumptions. What has to happen in order to convince you or to show you that if this happened, all the assumptions we've made about our business or we've made about our go-to-market are actually wrong, right? They've shifted. And these are the things that really kind of change scenarios and change our perspective as we go forward. Scenario planning as an activity is really about creating sense and making sense out of these things, and really understanding how to create these kinds of ideas of both plausible and implausible future frames. And implausible is actually a really important factor, because a lot of times in our normal day-to-day business, we are thinking about what is reasonable. We are trying to be reasonable. We are trying to be pragmatic. We are looking at things that are data-driven. And scenario planning is about sense making without maybe some of those concrete factors to rest on. And we'll talk about and show how those things can come to life. And lastly, the reason we do it is because it helps us improve our probability of success and reduce probability of failure. And that's what we're going to talk about today. When we think about how scenario planning fits into our work here at PK, we think about a few kind of key areas. In particular, given our pandemic situation, we've had a lot of conversations with clients and are working on things, kind of anchored in this area of rapid response. How do brands respond rapidly to kind of, changing things, moment by moment, day by day, where their businesses are either thriving, actually because they are chasing demand. Their business has really received a lot of demand that they hadn't expected, or they may just really be focused on surviving. How do they optimize? How do they keep the lights on? Decisioning is the area we're going to talk a little bit about today, which are like virtual workshops and scenario planning workshops, which is how do we go ahead and make sense of this, not just from a rapid response perspective, but a forward-looking perspective, right? If we can kind of anchor on these things and start to develop a perspective that allows us to be resilient into the future, what we're really able to do is to accelerate outcomes, whether that means rapid prototyping, whether that means creating iteration and kind of iterative kind of an approach, or it might be agile delivery, or in a B2B context, it might be customer success. But really, we're looking at kind of a landscape of possibility when we think about how does scenario planning fit into our world today. So looking at our current reality, how do we go ahead and how might we create future frames? And I'm going to kind of go through these relatively quickly, but really, again, this is from a grounding standpoint of, are we all looking at the same information? Are we all looking at the same trends and data? And what are we garnering when we look at these kinds of trends, and what kinds of implications are we coming across? So this is some early data that came out about a month ago, really focused in on like how has shelter in place kind of impacted consumer spending. And some of these things to us are obvious now. They are basically things that we've seen happen in our own lives. We've seen happen based on the reality that we live in. It's important to note that like a lot of this has been broken down into this idea of non-essential versus essential. And not that airline travel was non-essential, but it has kind of borne the brunt of a lot of these things based on kind of shelter in place mandates by many of the state governments and local governments in terms of what that might be. On the other hand, I talked about companies who are chasing demand. Instacart is certainly one of those. And when we look at kind of the data about grocery delivery, again, depending on who you are, it's not a surprising data point to kind of see the volume that Instacart has come forward with, and perhaps many of you are net new Instacart customers. But the real big thing that's been, I think, hampering us, and when we think about ourselves as companies and as brands, is really what is happening with unemployment. What is really killing us as people and kind of in locations. Many of us are lucky to be kind of in a profession, in an area where we can do remote work. And there are kind of a list of organization types and verticals and sectors that are able to kind of execute remote work, as opposed to those that are really out of work at this point, right? Again, sectors have been hit really hard. And when we think about the jobless claims and the percent unemployment that we are expected to get to, which is in the 15 to 20% range, depending on who you look at, it really is quite challenging. And I think getting back to work is a thing that people are talking about in kind of the economy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The other trend around kind of unemployment is that states, right? Whatever state you live in, whatever your kind of context is, what your reality is state matters, right? And whether we're looking at the percent of unemployment in certain states, like Michigan, Rhode Island, Hawaii, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, or we're looking at who's actually just got the highest number of jobless claims. Whether you live in those states or whether you're operating in those states, those are going to affect how your strategies start to play out. And certainly every state is very different, as well as kind of government and healthcare. We're seeing a ton of healthcare chaos. There's so much here that really just highlighting a couple of things to kind of make the point that in the US, we have kind of one challenge. Globally, we kind of fit within the sector of limited testing. Call it what you will, but we're in the kind of left-hand side of that. There are other countries that are doing moderate testing and other countries that are, more perhaps advanced, depending on who you believe in, that are doing broad testing. But one of those things that really important from a testing standpoint is there's a lot of belief that testing matters in terms of understanding how to make sense of the chaos that we're in. We're also suffering from a ton of political chaos. And by political chaos, I think really it's about cooperation and coordination. What is being coordinated? What is not? What are the beliefs that we may have had, 6 months ago about the level of coordination or cooperation necessary to overcome pandemics? And what is actually reality today? And these are things that we all have to deal with when we think about what does it mean to be in business? What does it mean to reopen? What does it mean to operate and drive sales, drive revenue in the markets that we operate? And of course, there are states that are reopening, and then there are highly populous states in yellow that are currently still under a very stringent or reasonably stringent stay-at-home or shelter-in-place orders. And a lot of this has to kind of then roll up to, like, what does it mean from a consumer confidence standpoint? Are people ready? What are people ready for? Are they ready to go back to concerts and sporting events? What kind of confidence is necessary for that to happen? What has to be true in order for that to happen? And we're seeing this start to play out in kind of shifting or disruptive business models. Kind of on the one hand, localities are really figuring it out, right? I think there's a lot of focus on kind of small business and the people who are out of work, and how do we collectively as communities help them? What does that mean from a perspective of like national brands or global brands and local brands? And there's quite a lot of upheaval there. One of the questions that I think that we want to answer collectively is, how do we be a part of a solution that makes the best of where we are today? At the same time, we're also seeing businesses pivot, right? Outback kind of doubling down on this idea of takeout business again. So these are not new things, but in terms of setting the context in a scenario planning workshop that you might be running or might be a part of, bringing the right kinds of trends into the mix is super important, and making sure that everyone has looked at and has shared different perspectives. Other shifting and disruptive business models, we're starting to see some, kind of acquisition type activity, things that are happening out there that say, businesses are rethinking what it means to meet the market where they are, meet people where they are. Whether it's, Amazon and AMC, whether it's this idea of dark stores where, stores really close for shopping, they become distribution centers. The rise of telehealth and the opportunity that this pandemic has created for telehealth for the folks who are, kind of really behind that motion. But also this idea that, we may just have to kind of figure out how to keep these places clean, and Amazon's kind of virus killing robot. These are all kinds of things. And then yesterday, Uber and Grubhub, kind of announced that they may be looking at a takeover there, and how that might affect us. So shifting gears just a little bit, so that's all fine and dandy, James. It's interesting. We've all seen this data. What does that mean for us? So critical uncertainties, some of the key questions that we're asking ourselves are how long, how deep, and where. We haven't seen bottom yet, is what everyone has said. And yet when we hit bottom, we don't want to be at the bottom. We want to kind of be moving back towards the top. And so how do we go about this? How do we go about what a safe reopening might be? And this is really an interesting point of friction. Again, when we think about the US in particular, but global as well, we think about like, well, what does it mean? Is Disneyland still Disneyland if you are highly sanitized and socially distant and wearing a face mask the whole time that you're there? What does that look like? What does that feel like? Is that still Disneyland? What does it mean to either have to go back to work because you have to, because you're out of a job now and you need the paycheck? Or what does it mean to be safe? What's more important, paycheck or being safe? And it's interesting as we take a look at a lot of the data that's out there, about how comfortable or uncomfortable are we at doing certain kinds of activities. And the folks who are kind of tracking data like this, and what may be a tipping point for you in your industry or your sector or your company where, a tipping point is achieved and you might want to start to react to that. Target, interestingly enough, I think it was yesterday, it might have been the day before, released kind of and published their quote unquote safe retail practice, which is really, hey, what can you expect when you shop at a Target in terms of safety? And they kind of made this available to other retailers, presumably to kind of set the bar and to say, hey, look, we are in business, we are a safe place to come, we're a safe place to shop, and we've got practices and policies in place to do so. And I think we're going to continue to see that transpire when we think about that. And this is a shock to me. And it may be a shock to you, it may not be, but this is something that I think has kind of reared its head over the last few days, just about this idea of like, hey, well, of course things will get better when there's a vaccine. So it's great that we've got a ton of companies globally racing to create a COVID-19 vaccine. And yet when we survey Americans, depending on who you look at, whether you're looking at age brackets or political affiliation, there are a good chunk of folks who say, no, not for me. And then lastly, there are wild cards. And again, I think you might look at me and say, well, hey, these are crazy. Like, these aren't going to happen. This is out of the scope of what we care about. But again, these are wild cards that would say, when we do scenario planning, we do want to stretch as broadly as possible so that we haven't narrowed in our aperture too narrowly. And whether that's domestic conflict, right? When folks are out of work, when people are unhappy, when the economy is bad, there are people who are frustrated and angry. There's a level of global conflict that is potentially possible. And then lastly, the virus itself. The more we know, the less we know, is what has been transpiring with coronavirus and COVID-19. And I think, we are still learning this, and it will continue to be learned as we kind of move into the future. So I'm going to pause there for a quick second. And when we think about trends and critical uncertainties, one thing that we'd want to do is have a poll and understand from each of you which of these trends keep you up at night. And go ahead and take a couple minutes to take this poll. You can select up to 3. But really, when we think of these trends, when we think of these critical uncertainties, the things that we really think about then is, how do we make sense of this? And the things that we think about when we think about sense making and future frames, and I've mentioned a few of these things as we go forward, are you've got to go broad, but they have to be specific enough to your business that you can see a little bit of a line to kind of things that you care about from your vertical, your sector, as well as the marketplace and market dynamics. You have to have extremes. You have to take trends and you got to kind of push them to the end, push them to their logical conclusion. Hey, a lot of times when you do forecasting, you're saying, hey, we see a 10% this or a 20% that, or we see a low probability of this or a higher probability of that. In scenario planning, what we really want to do is say, hey, if the world went all the way that way, what happens? Not because we think that's going to happen, but because that helps us create the right frame at which we can understand if we're thinking about this broadly enough. Definitely don't do it alone. You've got to use a cross-functional team. You have to bring people in from different parts of the business with different perspectives, because they're solving different problems, quite frankly, and also looking at other aspects that you may not be thinking about. Lastly, you want to know that it's going to be messy before it gets clean. As you start to think about this, it is an inherently challenging process. It takes time to kind of flush these things out. And then lastly, you're going to want to make sure that you kind of turn these future frames into things that people will remember. So as far as we think about, what we do when we make sense of these future frames is we ask ourselves kind of, what if? How might we? What must be true for us to be successful? And the thing that we're going to do now is take a look at a few future frames and maybe get some feedback on those as well. And I just had the poll results disappear on me, but let me see if I can, there they are. Okay, so I don't know if you all are seeing the poll results. It tells me that you are. Depth and duration of the recession. clearly the leading thing. How long will this last? What will it be? And then as a close second, the ongoing pandemic threat. So third, continued high unemployment. So those are the things that start rising. And it's interesting to see that governmental and political chaos also rise to the top, although it's not quite in the top three. It's a really close fourth. So let's take a look at one way that we might frame up the impact of COVID-19. And so based on the poll results, there were a few things that kind of fell into place there. COVID-19, unemployment, the economy. We're going to focus in first on kind of this idea of COVID-19 and impact, but certainly this will affect how we think about the economy and what it might take to be successful in this economy. So the two frames or the two dimensions that we created, and we created these dimensions probably about a month ago. And what I would say is I think they're holding up reasonably well. If anything, a bit more detail is going to be necessary as we think through what these things are. But really on the vertical axis, really this is about policies, and policies has a lot baked into it. And if you're working with your leadership team or your colleagues, defining what policies mean is going to be really important. We talk about government policies, fiscal policies, healthcare policies, whatever those things might be. But really what we're talking about here are policies around the economy, policies around government, as far as what level of coordination might be happening. And then on the horizontal axis, we're really looking at, are health measures effective? And are they ineffective? Or are they highly effective and shared really, really, really broadly? And let's take a look at what kind of emerges in these quadrants. So I'm going to start with the upper right-hand quadrant, which is labeled safety and confidence and immunity for all. And I think this is what we hope happens, right? We hope that we'll have effective policies. We hope that we'll have effective health measures. And I think we implicitly and perhaps explicitly know what those things are. But when we think about the trends that we just ran through and some of the critical uncertainties, we're not so sure that is going to happen. We don't know when that will happen, but we know that it is one part of a kind of an idealized future. There are a few things that are true here, even if this were to happen, is that work, life, and play will still be forever changed. People aren't going to be able to unsee what they've seen and perhaps not forget what they've learned. Their expectations will be a little bit different. Shifting to the upper left-hand quadrant. This is probably the sector where we think things are happening. When we think about like getting back to work, are we ready to get back to work? Will people do it? We think that there's going to be this idea of safe enough for most of us, safe enough for most people. We think this idea may be called like a 6-foot economy. But what does that look like? Venues, restaurants, stores at half capacity or less, social distancing, N95 masks for everybody, broadly implemented these ideas of contact tracing and isolation. These are things that are being talked about as solutions to getting back to work currently. And yet when we look at the data and we look at people's perceptions, we are asking ourselves that question. That's great that businesses want to reopen, but will they reopen? Will people return? What has to be true to make people return? And so this is really a world of managed risk, right? Where we will all kind of lift ourselves up and figure out how to adapt and make some decisions about, health, safety, and economy. The bottom left-hand quadrant is a place that we've been. And I think many of us also believe that we're still there. Safe enough for me, for those of us who still have jobs, for those of us who still are able to work and to kind of function in a quasi-normal capacity, this is safe enough for me, but the economy is a seesaw. We have no idea what's happening. Treatments are ineffective, experimental. They're still unavailable for the most part. And there's quite a lot of volatility and risk that we're seeing. And it's not a place we want to stay for long, but given what we've seen politically with states reopening and different perspectives on what that means or doesn't mean, it's very much kind of in a seesaw. In a specific locality, you may not see that seesaw, but when we think more broadly, we're definitely seeing different markets with different needs And if you put your kind of business planning, execution hat on, and one of the things that you would say, here's when we start to look at these things, that each of these scenarios are probably true or will be true for some amount of time forward. This last one here, safe for whom? We have effective health measures, but we have ineffective policies. And this is the one that scares me the most. And yet I see that this is highly likely, and certainly as likely as any of the other three scenarios, which is there are going to be treatments, there are going to be some level of immunity, there are going to be some level of a vaccine perhaps. But just because those things exist, don't mean they'll be deployed equally, fairly, globally, even within the US, even within markets. It's unclear that the level of coordination and cooperation that are happening today are going to actually drive that going forward. And so there's still going to be a different kind of risk. We've characterized it as societal risk, which is to say that there's going to be a level of volatility that will exist as long as there is kind of this idea of haves and have-nots. So COVID-19, awesome. Like these are things that we are seeing, that we can recognize. And the question to ask yourself from a planning standpoint, from a business standpoint is, if you think about your current strategy and plans today, and you look at the four scenarios, the question that you have to ask yourself and your leadership team has to ask yourself is, are we set to succeed in each of these four scenarios? And where might we have some gaps? Where might we have some strengths, either because our geographic footprint is a strength, perhaps you're only in markets that are well coordinated, or perhaps you're in markets that are highly uncoordinated. Those are all kinds of things that you want to look at when you think about, are we set up for success in this kind of unknown future of COVID-19? So the second frame we're going to look at is this idea of market fit. And market fit is something that that I think everyone thinks about kind of implicitly. Some companies have a very explicit idea of how they measure and track market fit, call it revenue, call it preference, call it sales, call it consumer research. All those things are true when we think about market fit. What we're seeing happen in the marketplace today, though, are this idea of two kind of core principles. One is whether or not people's preferences change. I said earlier, a lot of us won't be able to unsee what we've seen, and we're going to change because of it. Will that change be lasting? Will that change be fleeting? We don't know yet. We do know, we believe we know that the situation that we're in as a country, the situation that we're in globally, is at least as impactful as perhaps the Great Depression, certainly more impactful than the recession of 2008, perhaps more impactful than 9/11. But when we think about people's preferences changing radically, that is one side of the equation. And yet, we also know that there are a ton of people, many of you may be included in this, we don't want to change, right? We are happy, we like the way the world worked, we liked how we did things. We do want to go back to work. We don't want to always work remotely 100% of the time. We don't want to change. And I think when we think about that construct in general, I think we can acknowledge that there's going to be whole distribution kind of across the spectrum. And that's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge to track it, to know it, and to kind of plan for it. On the horizontal axis, it's really about this idea of how do you meet consumer preferences where they are. And so, right, there may be this idea that there's minimal change to economic drivers. And the ones that we've listed here are this idea of like labor, perhaps a cost of labor, perhaps a type of labor, and kind of cost from a fixed and variable standpoint. Will there be big swings in that, or can businesses be successful with minimal change to those types of economic drivers? Or is it that there needs to be a more radical change to economic drivers? Will there be different ways to meet consumers, to meet business partners where they are? You know, again, from a labor kind of fixed and variable standpoint. So let's take a look at those four scenarios. So again, I'm going to start in the bottom left this time, actually. So when we think about kind of minimal change, what does minimal change look like, and people not wanting to change? Well, it looks a little bit like business as usual. And what we think here is that the scenario that kind of emerges from this space, or that this idea that markets will favor businesses that have successfully weathered the storm, managed the operations and invested wisely. You know, hunkering down. If you can hunker down and emerge in the next 2, 4, 6, 8 months in good shape, then odds are that either you're in a sector where there have been minimal change to economic drivers, or perhaps where people don't want to change, or perhaps where there is some health measures that have emerged that are satisfying from a kind of a safety and a job safety standpoint. But really certain geos and sectors that we're seeing today, grocery, convenience stores, fast food, all kind of quasi-essential businesses, depending on who you ask, and really just meeting the requirements for safety. In the upper left-hand quadrant, really the scenario that emerges, if we think about minimal change, but preferences change radically, is that, you know, if businesses are able to capitalize on these kind of new expectations, that, you know, that they can be successful. And the companies who are kind of looking at that right now, it looks like telehealth is certainly there. They are kind of in the right place at the right time. Adoption has been a huge challenge for telehealth, but all the healthcare clients that we have and what we see out in the press is that it's booming. And why is it booming? Well, part of it is because it's one of the only ways you can have and see a healthcare practitioner. On the other hand, it's one of these things where you know, some people are finding out that they like the telehealth experience. Home delivery, technology as a sector in general are kind of adapting and thriving reasonably with kind of minimal change to their kind of core economic drivers. We do expect that there will be new competitive opportunities emerging in the sector as well that are still yet to be seen. In the bottom right-hand quadrant, where people don't want to change, but there are some radical change to economic drivers, this is a place where we think it's, you know, we've kind of named it fill the vacuum. And what we're really starting to see here is there are just businesses that won't be able to recover. And there are perhaps use cases where they're going to create new opportunities for other competitors or other companies that have strengths in those areas. There may be a recast of what retail, restaurants, entertainment, and travel look like. And that's going to be a different way that say, hey, look, people still want to travel, people still want to do those things. You know, how does Disneyland kind of execute against that type of thing? Their economic drivers are highly likely to change. There's now spending budget and chasing initiatives that they weren't chasing before, or that sounded like bad idea before, but now they sound like really great ideas. And in the upper right-hand quadrant, if preferences change radically and there are radical changes to economic drivers, we think of this idea of, you know, the markets are going to favor businesses who embrace these and kind of change their customer experience model, change their value proposition to kind of meet those needs. It will be a redefinition of shopping, eating out, leisure time, and work. There may be different ways to recast what it means to bring people back to work. Those are the kind of sectors that we see and the scenarios that we see in this kind of frame. And so kind of taking this one click down, if you will, and thinking about a specific area, similar to the COVID-19 scenario that we just walked through, looking at a frame like this, ideally you would be doing this kind of an exercise and kind of focus on your sector. You'd want to understand again, how will your strategies and plans perform if these things were to happen? Are you ready for them? Or do you have a strategy? Do you have a plan in place? Do you maybe know what the triggers might be? Will the impact be positive or negative, and why? Where are the gaps? Those are the kinds of things that you want to start to use the scenario for to ask yourself if that's possible. So kind of going down one click, we are going to take a quick poll. Which scenario are you most concerned with? Which scenario is the least maybe desirable for you to have happened to you in the business that you're in? And I think one of the things here that we see when we talk about this are every sector is very different. I think different sectors that we've listed here will start to have kind of a different level of impact. And certainly different players, again, like Uber comes to mind with Grubhub, kind of have a different level of desire to change their future. You know, Uber has certainly been hampered really heavily in this kind of current economy and this current 6-foot reality that we live in, and they're looking for other ways out. one of our other clients, DSW, had recently implemented a partnership. So DSW sells shoes. They implemented a partnership with Hy-Vee, which is a supermarket chain, really because it becomes a distribution center for their shoes, in which case, as a non-essential business, they're able to kind of distribute there. So looking at a particular sector then, we're going to take a look at grocery. Whoop. So new realities. So going back to the poll results, new realities is the most pressing, challenging, and I think that makes sense. Filling the vacuum is a distant second, adapt and then business as usual. And so I think this idea of radical change to economic drivers and kind of brand new, but maybe not so new, expectations by people, really this idea of will they stick, is something that's super important. So let's take a look at maybe how grocery flexes or doesn't flex to meet the same future frame. So starting in the upper right-hand quadrant, since folks really kind of focused on, changing radically and kind of these new realities, we've seen a lot of innovation, a lot of change in the marketplace when it comes to food, when it comes to grocery. We've learned how to shop a certain way. We've learned how to have groceries delivered. We've learned how to do a lot of takeout. Restaurants have learned how to do a lot of takeout. And in addition to that, it's not like the national chains, although we saw Outback earlier, but we also saw that folks are like, you know what, I'm going to support my local business. So we don't know how this will transpire, but in this scenario, if we start to think about like, what does this look like for grocery? It starts to look like, in parentheses, local, but perhaps a Netflix of food. What does that look like? Everything from perhaps personal dedicated shopping, think Instacart, recipes, meal suggestions or boxes, groceries, perhaps prepared restaurant quality food to your doorstep. How does that start to unify? And clearly Uber Eats and Grubhub are poking at that space, but we could imagine a lot of other organizations and entities might do that. And then local restaurants have banded together to create their own mini delivery services as well. And so those are things that would kind of aspire to happen here on the grocery sector. On the upper left-hand quadrant, when we think about kind of the adapt sector, this is probably feels a little bit like your favorite grocery store with just lots of pickup and kind of optional doorstep delivery options. Will you step foot into a grocery store in this scenario? Maybe, maybe not. There may be simplified ordering and replenishment opportunities. They may be driven by voice and home automation. So whether you're using Amazon Echo or Google Home, there may be ways to kind of automate that process in some way, use voice, use in-home scanning kinds of technologies. But those are a place where people have decided going to the grocery store, spending time in the grocery store, I've lived without it this far, I can keep living without it, and I like the time that I got back. In the bottom right-hand quadrant, where we talk about kind of what does economic driver change look like when people don't want change, really this starts to think about like, what are the physical shopping experience that are touchless or contactless? Are there ways that can be automated from a checkout standpoint? And Amazon Go earlier this year had announced that they were looking at, or not looking at, they were licensing kind of their, what they basically just say, walk out shopping. So just walk out is kind of their tagline. But also this idea that in these places, if you feel like you want to be in a physical place, you don't want to change kind of your shopping habits, the kind of self-serve bars and the Whole Foods and your local grocery stores, those won't be self-serve anymore. How does that start to change? And do we see a future where, supermarkets and restaurants kind of come together in a place that says, hey, we want to meet people where they are. We want to recognize that, but we're going to change the nature of food and food shopping and food buying and meal buying. And then in the bottom left-hand quadrant, I think this is what we're familiar with today. I would say Target is probably a half click ahead of this, along with most grocery stores. At least they've come through and said, we have a standard. So kudos to Target for doing that, but really this is about your favorite store enhanced with these things. We think that this idea of capacity management, reservations, or scheduling will start to make its way forward on this. We've already seen this in local grocery store chains, limiting kind of capacity. We think technology will be a part of how that will light up in the future, as well as kind of these ideas of, again, publishing and perhaps competing on this idea of sanitation, right? So one thing that Target is clearly doing and that other organizations are also starting to do is to kind of compete on this idea of safety, which is a new dimension for most sectors where competing on safety has never been something that they've had to do. You know, whether we call it safety or confidence, those are two kind of words that we are thinking a lot about these days when we think about how do you compete in this new world. So the third and last poll is, as a consumer, which one of these scenarios is a scenario that you would say, if it were executed really well, I would love for this to happen? So maybe just take a few seconds to kind of make your selection. So as those votes are still coming in, so how do we go about creating value from scenario planning? An awful lot of it will come in preparation. You know, a lot of leadership teams kind of, quite frankly, don't have the time to kind of gather and do the pre-research and bring all the kind of right things into the room. And when I'm saying room, I'm talking about a virtual room today, but bring things into the room and really make sure that we're covering the right amount of ground. And you know, pre-research is just that, it's pre-research. It's not what happens in the workshop itself. But super important also to have the right facilitator and the right attendees, right? You want to have people who are bought into the idea that we can learn something by stretching our minds and our expectations and our conventional wisdoms perhaps, and reframing the future to maybe see something just a little bit different. The workshop itself, you know, these things can be done in a couple hours, they can be done over a couple of days, but really this is a place where, you know, I would say the hard work happens where you get dirty and then clean. And just looking at this, so physical shopping experience with touchless automated checkout. So the bottom right-hand quadrant. So it sounds like, you know, hey, if we could still go and pick out our own stuff, we have a kind of a hand in that. I don't believe that automation can do it, but I don't want to touch anything, and I want to have a very, very safe environment is what we on this particular webinar would like to see happen. But interestingly enough, the local, quasi-local, quasi-not Netflix of food is a close second. Convenience and quality are going to matter there, but it's interesting to see that your favorite grocery store, so the bottom left-hand quadrant where nothing changes and just gets a little bit better, perhaps a Band-Aid would be there, is the last. Again, small sample size, but I think interesting for us to think about when we think about where might grocery go. And if this were 2,000 respondents and you're a grocery store executive, what would you be doing right now? Looking at kind of what these scenarios might do. So in the workshop itself, really this is a co-creation exercise, right? It is looking at the trends, is looking at the dynamics, it is whiteboarding and or virtual whiteboarding of various future frames, dimensions that are important to the leadership team, and really kind of drafting and testing. This is a very iterative process. You can get this done again in a few hours to a few days. Different teams take different kinds of amounts of time in different organizational environments, but it is something that requires hands-on level of, I would say, co-creation and buy-in into helping create these frames. And then on the right-hand side, it's really, so what do you do with the scenarios once you're done with them, and how do you accelerate outcomes when we think about using scenario planning as a tool? They have to be memorable. You've got to give them names. You have to understand what specific triggers would make a scenario true, at least at a high level. And then you have to be using the scenario and asking and responding to those scenarios. Whether that means doing kind of an audit, whether that means understanding and highlighting with a kind of, again, a multidisciplinary team. Well, you know, we'll have all sorts of people in that room and they will say, we can't do that. Someone should ask, well, why not? We don't have the system, we don't have the experience, we don't have the supply chain. All those things start to show themselves in a conversation where really, again, it's about exploration in order to understand what the commonalities might be between the four scenarios. In terms of accelerating outcomes, really this is about, looking at the scenarios, flushing them out just a little bit further, identifying whether we call them moments that matter from a consumer experience standpoint or broader idea of consumer journeys. We want to understand what is true from a scenario standpoint, and then building roadmaps. Again, high-level roadmaps or plans start to give the team a sensibility of what the company has to do to support executing against that particular future frame. And you might say at this point, well, James, that sounds like a really stupid idea because it just, we barely get it together creating a single roadmap. And I would say, yes, but at a high level, creating those paths forward for these different scenarios is really important to understand when you're facing that so that you can be proactive and not reactive. Again, monitoring these triggers and respective actions, the executive team or the leadership team should understand if this happens, that means we have to shift. We have to shift our focus. We have to shift our roadmap. We have to shift our budgeting, our financing, whatever it might be, to why. And then lastly, this really just means that companies, we talk about, COVID-19 driving digital transformation and kind of accelerating that, and everything that was attempted pre-COVID-19 has just been accelerated here. It's the same thing with organizations. Really, it's time that organizations start to think about how do we drive a very dynamic, active test and learn approach, whether they're prototypes, proofs of concept, analytics, whatever those things are, to kind of really start to build that muscle. So of course, we here at PK, have done a lot of this. I think one of the things that we think of when we think about creating the value from scenario planning again is really, we focus in on kind of a day-long time period. We have broken that up into 3 1/3 day kind of sessions. We've broken that up into 2 half-day sessions. I think, again, here it really just depends on kind of organizational decision-making styles, the ability to get kind of time on calendars, and I would say blocking the right amount of time to have the right level of discussion. As we think about when we do one-day scenario planning workshops, right, we focus on the scenario plans, we focus on kind of identifying and ideating on strategy and tactics, and then doing some kind of rough, high-level kind of ROM prioritization, right? I think those are things that start to become really important. And then, of course, because of the kind of the scale and the scope of the firm that we have, we're able to help clients really accelerate outcomes. And whether that means, again, just, kind of business modeling and ROM scenario impacts all the way through to like exploring strategic pivots. Those are things that we have done historically and are starting to see a lot more activity on over the last couple of months. So I will just close with, kind of the last slide here, just kind of our toolkit again. I think when we think about kind of the world we live in today and the foreseeable future for the next 12, 24, 36 months, really it's, how are we adapting to emerging market dynamics and expectations? How are we co-creating with our clients resilient consumer and employee experiences? And then lastly, kind of defining, executing kind of contactless engagement, whether it's, again, in really rapid response frames of reference, so get it done now, get it done quickly. We have to kind of keep the lights on, whether that means being super intentional about making strategic decisions and framing the future and what's possible, or whether that means, hey, look, we've already made some decisions internally, we just need to execute. And again, I'll reference the Target, a SAFE manual that they put out, again, I think it was yesterday, is really this idea of like, within that kind of, that blueprint that they provided, how does it actually show up? How does it come to life? How do they convince people that it's actually safe to shop at Target and perhaps the best place to shop at Target and nowhere else? I think the kind of accelerating outcomes for Target is really going to be about bringing that to life, and bringing that to life is going to take some time, but they need to be accelerating that process if at all possible. So with that, we've got about, I think about 10 minutes for Q&A. I don't know if there were questions from this. I know that I was probably talking reasonably quickly, but wanted to make sure that we kind of got through, again, kind of level setting and grounding on kind of all the trends and kind of, I'd say, uncertainty that may be out there, and then kind of framing it at 3 levels, both on kind of COVID-19, framing it just from a kind of a business and consumer standpoint, and then looking at a specific sector around grocery.
Thanks, James. So we did get a few questions that came in. I'll just start with the first one. How do you rationalize the recessionary impacts on healthcare with loss in revenue and layoffs happening in healthcare while in the middle of a pandemic? This kind of dichotomy is paradoxical. What is the implication for healthcare organizations in that situation?
No, that's a great question. I think, um, the reality of, I think, why that has happened is, the shift towards being COVID-19 prepared. I think in the early part of this year, as different markets and different organizations were kind of gearing up for the potential for our healthcare system to be really out of capacity or over capacity, there was a lot of shifting that went through. Shelter in place affected a lot of these healthcare organizations by restricting procedures to things that are essential, deemed essential, and or COVID-19 related. I think it tells me a couple of things. It tells me that healthcare organizations need to be innovative to create experiences or recreate their kind of physical footprint to accommodate kind of what I characterize as non-COVID related versus kind of elective or other types of essential surgeries or visits. I think it will be a mix of telehealth growing and what I'd say with the telehealth is, we think of telehealth as being a telehealth first type experience, really accelerating this idea of what does it mean to have digital points of care and drive healthier outcomes. And I think that means disproportionately the healthcare organizations will have to invest, not just double down, triple down, quadruple down on not just the same thing they're doing with telehealth today, but to actually expand the idea of what telehealth means to consumers, much in the way that we saw with grocery. What is that version of healthcare that feels like it's on demand, that feels like it's accessible to me and helps me improve my health? I think the second part is from a physical footprint standpoint, and there were a number of folks who kind of talked about this over the last couple of months. And when I say a number of folks, healthcare professionals and governmental officials, is around like, should there be COVID-19 hospitals, right? Should they segregate the population in such a way that, a specific building can be isolated for kind of COVID-19 situation and other physical facilities be allocated towards other types of procedures. And I think as opposed to having the sixth floor of a hospital be the COVID-19 ward and everything else be non-COVID-19. I think we will have to start to see some of that happen. Again, the organizations that are able to kind of pivot to that structure will be able to, I think, continue to provide non-COVID-19 support, wherever those things are, kind of elective surgeries and or other essential surgeries and procedures. But it definitely forces a rethink again on the economic model that they have, that healthcare organizations have long, I would just say, rested on. Right? These are changes to the economic model.
Great, thanks, James. Here's another question. Can we use scenario planning for our team or work group, or does this have to be at the corporate level?
I think it depends a little bit on what team or work group you are associated with. I would say product groups, actually, absolutely, for sure, right? I think any sort of product organization inside of a company is by default creating part of their customer, consumer, user experience for the organization. And I think that's where understanding those things are really important. I would add that I think really great product leaders and managers already do this, I would say somewhat synthetically or in the background, which is to kind of plan for contingencies. And I think on the one hand, scenario planning helps you add a little bit of, I would say, confidence that your contingency planning is thinking broadly enough and that you're looking at a wide enough aperture when you think about the contingencies that you're planning for. But I think it can definitely help product owners, it can help product organizations, and I would say, a retail group inside of a larger an organization where retail is perhaps one of 2, 3, 4 channels that the organization operates in. It definitely is valuable in that effect, because I think it will also point to gaps and opportunities for other organizations within the firm. I think that if you are the head of a stores organization, I think that it behooves you to do something like this, because then you can identify, hey, look, stores are going to have to change. It's not just all about digital. We're going to have to work together on this, and it's going to force that kind of collaboration.
Okay, great. Next question is, what's the risk of not doing scenario planning?
I think the risk of not doing scenario planning is really just is missing some cues and moving forward on a directive that is agreed upon by a team that hasn't cast the net broadly enough to understand where their blind spots are. If nothing else, I think the exercise will either reinforce, hey, the leadership team is great, we have no blind spots, or it will raise the issue of, you know what, we're 80% right, but we've got these blind spots, these 2 blind spots that we need to address, and scenario planning is going to help do that. And I think the organizations who do scenario planning will have fewer blind spots than the organizations who don't.
Okay, and this one seems to follow up to that question. How often should you do this kind of activity, and what does it take to update the scenarios after you've worked them out?
Sure. I think that scenarios are generally a little bit of a living and breathing type of an artifact. I think that they do need to be updated as new events happen. As new events happen, though, I think understanding what triggers you're looking for, or what inflection points you're looking for, will help you understand if you need to recalibrate your scenarios. And so again, in the COVID-19 example that we showed earlier, if remdesivir proves to be a really effective treatment, then that scenario is something that would have to start to be recalibrated, unless supply of remdesivir becomes something that is highly constrained. In which case that scenario still holds up, because we end up in the haves have not column or scenario. But those are the kinds of things that you'll want to understand if they've affected your dimensions or they've affected a particular scenario. But I think quarterly is something that definitely feels like a reasonable amount of time to let these things kind of percolate and to look back, because looking back after 1 quarter is also going to help you understand whether or not the scenarios you set up were kind of long-lived enough, or again, maybe still too narrowly focused.
Okay, we are approaching the top of the hour, and I know a few other people had asked about whether the recording of this webinar would be available, and yes, the answer is yes. We will send it out with a link with a follow-up email after the webinar concludes. It'll go out tomorrow to everyone that's attended or at least registered. And then back to you, James, you can wrap it up.
Oh, no, thank you. Thanks, Linda. And hey, thanks everyone for coming to the webinar. I think that this is a super important topic for all of us. I would say that, if you have follow-up questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn, ask me questions, happy to re-engage or to follow up with anything specific that you might have.